Hi everybody, it's your human anatomy and physiology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we're starting a new unit. It's on the cardiovascular system. Our last one was about blood, which is the substance that the cardiovascular system carries, right? So we talked about what blood's made of, what does it do, what are the implications of the stuff in your blood, all of that kind of stuff we talked about. But today we're getting into its kind of twin unit here, which is the system that moves around that blood, which is the cardiovascular system. So this video is going to be focused on the heart, and particularly the anatomy of the heart and its main functions, the cardiovascular system, including how does it actually get blood to and fro around your body. And what's the point of getting blood to and fro around your body? Then we're going to get into the cardiac cycle, how specifically does the heart beat, and then after that we'll get into both blood pressure and blood vessels. All right, so let's start this off here. Let's get into the main functions of the cardiovascular system. Okay, the first thing I'd like to point out here is that all the diagrams that you're going to see here are going to have deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood. The deoxygenated blood is blue in the diagrams, and the oxygenated blood is represented by red. But red is always the color of blood. It is never, ever, ever blue. Blue is just representing that there is no oxygen in that blood, or there's little oxygen in that blood. Okay? Another important thing I'm going to point out right away is that the main function of the cardiovascular system is, I'm not going to give you credit on your test if you just put it pumps blood. Okay? That is not specific enough. What I would like to see is that, the cardiovascular system, it delivers oxygen from the lungs to all vascular tissues, meaning that all the tissues that have access to blood get oxygen delivered to them by the cardiovascular system. In addition, the cardiovascular system also delivers nutrients from the digestive system to all vascular tissues, so glucose, amino acids, lipids, all that stuff. It's going to deliver wastes from vascular tissues to the urinary system and the kidneys, and the kidneys will flush those out eventually. The cardiovascular system also regulates body temperature, and it really serves as the superhighway of the body. It actually is a way for hormones and other endocrine chemicals to get around the body as well. Oh, it's one of the ways that hormones get around the body. But yeah, these are more specifically the functions of the cardiovascular system. It's not just pumping blood. It's getting oxygen, nutrients, wastes, regulating body temperature, all that stuff are the functions of the cardiovascular system. When I say cardiovascular system, what am I talking about? Well, if we break apart the word, cardio means heart, vascular means vessels, and that's the entirety of the system. It's the heart and all the blood vessels, arteries, veins, venules, arterioles, and capillaries, which we'll get into in our third video. We can break down the cardiovascular system into two circuits, or two loops, and they kind of form a figure eight. We're going to look at that in just a second. We can study the pulmonary circuit, which sends oxygen-poor blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen and unload carbon dioxide, because that's really what's going on here, gas exchange. All of your cells need ATP in order to function, and how do they get ATP? Well, they need oxygen in order to do that. So that's really what your blood is doing, is delivering that oxygen. So we pick up that oxygen in the pulmonary circuit, drop off carbon dioxide, you breathe it out. And then in the systemic circuit, that is when your heart sends that oxygen-rich blood to all the tissues of the body that need that oxygen, and then delivers that oxygen-poor blood back to the heart so that it can join the pulmonary circuit again. Okay, an illustration of this looks like this. Here's an overview of the cardiovascular system that we're going to look at. So it's really just like a figure eight. That's all the cardiovascular system really is. We have a systemic circuit and a pulmonary circuit. So the systemic circuit includes the heart and the rest of the body. The pulmonary circuit includes the lungs and the heart. Okay, so if we're walking through here, first thing, the heart sends oxygen-poor blood via the pulmonary circuit over to the lungs. And then the lungs, thanks to its exposure to the atmosphere and to air, supplies the blood with oxygen and sends that oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. And then from there, what does the heart do? Its job is to send that oxygen-rich blood over to all the body tissues that need it via the systemic circuit. And then finally, the body has to send back oxygen-poor blood to the heart, so that this process can repeat and it can come back to the lungs. All right, I highly suggest drawing this in your notebook if you have not already. And I would suggest having blue and red markers as well. All right, so before we get into the anatomy of the heart, let's talk about the heart wall, the three main components here. And we're going to see some familiar Latin root words here. Hooray, we've been doing that all year. So the three main layers of the heart are the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. Epi obviously means above, so this is the outermost layer. Its job is to protect the heart by reducing friction. The heart's contracting a lot, and it might create a lot of friction. So the epicardium, it protects the heart and it reduces the friction. Myocardium is the middle layer that contains cardiac muscle, because remember, cardiac muscle, that's the muscle tissue that's only found in the heart, and it's autorhythmic and involuntary, meaning that it's going to contract on its own. And then finally, the endocardium is the innermost layer. It's made up of epithelial tissue and connective tissue that kind of holds it all together. Okay, so those are our three layers of the heart wall. Now, we're going to be filling out this diagram. So if you don't have this diagram handy, make sure you do, because we're going to go over this in, well, kind of detail in a little bit. But here's the thing. In this video, I'm not just going to be like, oh, yeah, here, just label willy-nilly and then, you know, memorize it. Okay, we're going to be walking through the path blood takes through the heart, just kind of like we did with the figure 8 through the pulmonary and systemic circuits here. We're going to take it step by step. All right, what we're going to start with first are the chambers. You have 4 chambers in your heart. You have 2 atria and you have 2 ventricles. The right and left atrium, atria is plural, are the upper chambers with thin walls, and their job is to receive blood returning from the heart. So the atria receive blood from either the body, the deoxygenated blood from the body, or the oxygenated blood from the lungs. It's going to receive that. Okay, the other 2 chambers, the inferior 2 chambers, are the ventricles, and they are muscular and they have thick walls, and their job is to force blood out of the heart and get that into arteries. Okay, so the left ventricle is going to pump blood to the rest of the body through the aorta. It's the largest artery in the body, and the right ventricle is going to start sending blood to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. Okay, so the atria receive blood, the ventricles pump it out, they get rid of it. Okay, and between every chamber and the arteries are valves. Okay, so valves are these little, you know, I don't have another word for them. They're valves. They separate the chambers, and they prevent blood from flowing backwards. Blood needs to go from one chamber to the next. Atrium, ventricle out. Atrium, ventricle out. Okay, it can't be going backwards, splashing around. Because that's inefficient, and then you're not going to get the right amount of blood delivered to where it needs to go if your blood is not flowing in one direction. So it needs to be efficiently flowing in one direction. Atrium, ventricle, out, and it can't be flowing backwards. Okay, and then there's another structure in the middle that separates out the 2 ventricles. That is called the septum, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more and the structures in the septum later on. So here's the septum. It's not labeled on the diagram, but you know, that's what it is. Here's the right atrium. Hey, here's the right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. And by the way, but you might be thinking like, oh, wait, hold on, isn't this the right and isn't this the left? Well, you're looking at it like you're looking on at it as if it's in somebody's body right here. They're in anatomical position, right? So this is their right side, and this is the left side, okay? So there's our 4 chambers. Hey, fun fact, like fish have 2-chambered hearts, and reptiles have 3-chambered hearts, but mammals and birds have 4-chambered hearts. So there you have it. Pretty interesting. The vena cava, what are those? They are the largest veins in the body, and this is where we're going to start our journey of our blood flow through the heart. The inferior vena cava is a large vein that receives deoxygenated blood from the inferior tissues, okay, so from your digestive system, from your urinary system, from everything below the heart, okay, that's going to be collected into the inferior vena cava, deoxygenated blood. The superior vena cava is, well, it's above it, and it's going to collect blood from your arms and from your head and brain and stuff. And that's going to be dropped off into the right atrium. Okay, so the 2 vena cavae, the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava, they are both going to be depositing deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. So here they are. Here's that deoxygenated blood. It's getting dropped off into the right atrium, and that's going to fill with deoxygenated blood. Where does it go from there? Well, it's going to pass through this valve into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle is going to pump that out. It's going to contract and make sure it gets through this thingy, which we'll talk about in just a second. Okay, so here are the valves that are involved in the right side of the heart. You have the tricuspid valve and the pulmonary valve. The tricuspid valve is between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and its job is to prevent blood flow in the opposite direction, like we were talking about before. It can't be splashing around going both ways. It needs to move one way, and the tricuspid valve is one of those that prevents that from happening, from it splashing around, right? Make sure it goes from right atrium to right ventricle and it doesn't go backwards. So once, like I said before, once we have a bunch of blood in the right atrium, the tricuspid valve opens up, allows it to go pass into the right ventricle, and then it closes, and then the right ventricle contracts and forces blood towards the pulmonary arteries, the arteries that are carrying blood to the lungs to pick up that oxygen. Okay, but before it gets to the pulmonary arteries, it has to pass through the pulmonary valve, and that's between the right ventricle and the pulmonary arteries, once again, preventing backflow. All right, so if we look at our diagram here, here's our right atrium, passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle contracts, and then it has to pass through the pulmonary valve, okay, once again, preventing backflow, and then, of course, it goes into the pulmonary arteries. This is actually the pulmonary trunk over here, and it divides into two pulmonary arteries. Why does it divide into two? Well, one goes to each lung, right? So this is going to the left lung, and this is going to the right lung. All right, and it's going to go pick up some oxygen. All right, so there's our pulmonary valve, tricuspid valve, and that's part of our pulmonary circuit here. Okay, so now we get to the left side of the heart when that blood comes back after it's been to the lungs and it's picked up oxygen from the alveoli in the lungs. So it's got its oxygen. It needs to come back to the heart so that the heart can pump it to the rest of the body, right? So the left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. Okay, pulmonary arteries went towards the lungs. Pulmonary veins are coming back from the lungs. They're coming towards the heart now. Okay, so that oxygenated blood, it collects into the left atrium, right? The left atrium, it passes through what's called the mitral valve to the left ventricle. Same thing, right? It opens up the left atrium, or excuse me, the mitral valve opens up, allows the blood from the left atrium to enter the left ventricle, right? And then the left ventricle contracts and it pumps oxygenated blood out towards the rest of the body through what we call the aortic valve. Okay, so we've got, it's the same thing almost, except instead of going to the lungs, they're now going to the rest of the body. Okay, so we're going from the left ventricle to the aortic valve. All right, so here's our diagram once again. Our pulmonary veins brought in that oxygenated blood from the lungs, collects in the left atrium. The mitral valve opens up, allows that blood to enter into the left ventricle. Mitral valve closes to prevent backflow, okay? And then the left ventricle contracts, squeezes that oxygenated blood through the aortic valve and out to the aorta, which is the largest vessel in the whole body. It receives oxygenated blood from the left ventricle and it sends it to body tissues, right? So this is like a garden hose in diameter. It's a huge artery. All right, and all the different branches of the aorta are forming all the major arteries that you've heard of before, like your carotid artery, subclavian artery, brachial artery, femoral artery. Okay, so all those arteries are stemming from the aorta. Okay, so here's our completed diagram, and the last thing is that we labeled this as the aorta. All right, so that is the gist of how the blood flows through the heart. Blood from the systemic circuit enters into the vena cava. Okay, that collects into the right atrium. The right atrium opens up, or excuse me, the tricuspid valve opens up, allows blood to go from the right atrium to the right ventricle. And then once the right ventricle contracts, the pulmonary valve opens up, allows the blood to go to the pulmonary arteries, and then it picks up oxygen in the lungs. It comes back to the heart via the pulmonary veins and collects in the left atrium. Okay, and then it passes through the mitral valve in order to get to the left ventricle. Mitral valve closes up to prevent backflow. Then the left ventricle contracts, and the aortic valve opens up, allows it to pass into the aorta, and then through the aorta and enters all the arteries and goes back to the systemic circuit. All right, so that is it for this video. In our next video, we're going to talk about specifically how does the heart contract via the cardiac cycle. All right, so let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.